The rain had been falling since late afternoon, steady and soft at first, like a shy visitor tapping at the windows. By evening, it had deepened into a rhythmic drumming, steady as a heartbeat, filling the little stone cottage with a sound both soothing and isolating. Outside, the world blurred, trees melted into shadowy shapes, their branches sagging under the weight of water. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of damp wood and the faint trace of lavender from the fire-warmed blankets. Isabel sat curled in her chair, a book resting half open on her lap, though she hadn't turned a page in over 20 minutes. She wasn't reading anymore. She was listening. Listening to the rain, yes, but also to the way it seemed to carry whispers. She had always loved storms. They gave her an excuse to stay indoors without guilt, to light the hearth and brew tea, to lose herself in worlds made of words. But tonight felt different. There was a heaviness to the weather, as if the clouds were not simply spilling rain but pressing the sky downward. A low fog clung to the hills, and the forest beyond the cottage looked impossibly dark, its outlines shifting like something alive. Isabel caught herself glancing toward the window more often than usual, each time expecting to see. What, exactly? She couldn't say. The feeling was neither fear nor excitement, but a strange mixture of both. Like being on the brink of a story you haven't yet been told. The kettle whistled sharply, startling her into motion. She poured the steaming water over dried chamomile blossoms, watching the pale gold tendrils curl upward, scenting the air with something calming and floral. But even as she breathed it in, she couldn't shake the pull of the outside world. She moved to the window and pressed her fingertips to the cold glass. Beyond the rain-slicked panes, the path leading into the forest glistened faintly under the scattered light of the oil lamp. She imagined footsteps there, splashing softly in the puddles, an image so vivid that her chest tightened, though no one was in sight. When the knock came, it was almost too gentle to hear over the storm. A single tap, then another, then silence. Isabel froze, her breath caught somewhere between her throat and her lungs. In her years living here, visitors were rare, and unannounced visitors at night were unheard of. She set her cup down and approached the door slowly, feeling the old wooden boards shift slightly beneath her weight. Another knock, firmer this time. She hesitated, then drew back the latch and opened the door just a crack. A man stood there, though man seemed too simple a word for what she saw. His shoulders filled the doorway, his cloak dripping rain onto the threshold, and his eyes, deep, amber, and unblinking, held hers with a strange intensity. His features were striking, almost beautiful, but edged with something wild, untamed. Behind him, the forest swayed, and for an instant, Isabel thought she saw something else moving in the shadows beyond, something large and hulking, a shape that vanished the moment she blinked. Marcus eased the car past the crooked welcome sign, his headlights sweeping over the slick pavement ahead. The storm didn't let up, but the rain seemed different here, less like a storm, more like a constant sheet falling straight down, as if the air itself had given up on weather and chosen monotony instead. He drove slowly, eyes straining for movement, for any sign of life. A town, even a forgotten one, should have lights, or at least the warm glow of windows. But the road stretched on, empty and unlit, the silence between the hammering rain louder than ever. The first house appeared at the curve of the road, a narrow two-story with sagging shutters and a porch that leaned forward, as though bowing under its own weight. Marcus slowed, scanning the windows. They were dark, every last one of them. But he had the eerie impression that behind the glass, someone was standing, holding their breath. He told himself he was being ridiculous, that the empty house was just that, empty. Still, his stomach knotted tighter as he passed, as if he'd crossed an invisible threshold into somewhere that did not welcome him. More houses followed. Some were small, single-story cottages with peeling paint and roofs caved in from years of neglect. Others were larger, boxier structures with porches like hollow mouths. None had lights. None showed life. Marcus slowed to a crawl, searching for evidence of people. Cars in driveways, toys left in yards, anything. But there was nothing. The rain beat down steadily, yet the streets looked too clean, too untouched, as though nothing had stirred there in years. He reached instinctively for his phone, but of course, there was still no signal. Just the dead weight of black glass. The road curved again, and Marcus found himself in what must have been the town's center. A handful of buildings stood clustered around a cracked, weed-pocked square. A general store with a faded sign, a diner with windows clouded by grime, and a small church with a broken steeple pointing like a finger at the storm. His headlights cut across the square, briefly illuminating a set of footprints in the wet pavement. They were fresh, darker than the rest of the rain-slicked ground, leading across the square and vanishing between the buildings. Marcus stopped breathing for a moment. He wasn't alone. He pulled the car to a stop, engine idling, his hands frozen on the wheel. The idea of stepping out into the rain made his chest tighten, but so did the thought of just driving past. Someone had to live here. Someone had to know the way out. The footprints, proof of life, were the first real sign of humanity he'd seen since entering Duskfield. Yet something about them gnawed at him. The stride looked uneven, the gaps irregular, as though whoever had made them had staggered or been dragged. Marcus sat there, staring into the dark alleys beyond the square, until the storm seemed to muffle itself into silence. Marcus cut the engine, and the silence that followed was suffocating. Without the hum of the motor, the storm seemed to close in on him, every drop of rain amplified. He sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, his hand on the door handle, debating whether stepping outside was worth it. But those footprints lingered in his mind, pulling him forward like a thread. He told himself that finding someone, anyone, would be better than sitting here alone with nothing but his thoughts. Finally, he drew in a shaky breath and opened the door. The rain hit him immediately, cold and relentless, soaking through his jacket within seconds. He pulled the hood up and shut the door, the metallic clunk echoing far too loudly in the empty square. For a moment, he expected curtains to twitch or shadows to shift, but the town remained still, watching without moving. He moved toward the footprints cautiously, the water splashing under his boots. Up close, he noticed something odd. The prints weren't just wet, they seemed pressed deep, as though whoever made them was carrying an impossible weight. He followed the trail slowly across the cracked square, each step loud against the rain. The prints led him toward the diner, its neon sign broken, only the faint outline of letters visible in rusted metal. He peered inside the smeared windows, straining to see past his own reflection. Inside, the booths and tables were still there, though coated in dust and shadow. A coffee pot sat abandoned on the counter, its glass stained dark as though it had been filled once, long ago. He felt his chest tighten at the uncanny stillness, like everyone had left mid-meal and never returned. The prints continued, veering sharply toward the alley between the diner and the general store. Marcus hesitated. The alley yawned like a black mouth, the rain barely touching its interior. He glanced back at his car, its headlights glowing weakly through the downpour, and considered turning back. But curiosity gnawed at him, an almost magnetic pull. Something about those uneven footprints demanded answers. He stepped forward into the alley's shadow, his footsteps quieter now, as though the air itself was swallowing sound. Halfway down the alley, he froze. The prints ended abruptly in a small, shallow puddle. No more steps led forward, backward, or sideways. It was as if whoever had left them had simply vanished. Marcus crouched, rain dripping off his hood into the water, watching the surface ripple under his breath. His skin crawled with the undeniable sense that the owner of those steps was still near, not gone, just hidden. He rose slowly, turning toward the darkness at the far end of the alley, only to hear it then. The faint crunch of footsteps behind him, where the square lay empty. Marcus spun toward the square, heart pounding so hard it drowned out the rain. The headlights of his car still burned weakly across the cracked pavement, but the space around it was empty. No figure moved across the square, no shadow flickered at the edge of vision. Yet he knew what he had heard. That deliberate crunch of weight on wet stone had not been his imagination. The sound had been too real, too close, too purposeful. He stood frozen, the alley wall slick with rain at his sides, his pulse hammering in his ears. The thought of running back to the car flared in his mind, bright and frantic, but something in him resisted. He couldn't explain it. Pride, fear of looking foolish, or perhaps the deeper instinct that told him turning his back would be dangerous. He stepped carefully toward the square again, retracing his path, each movement loud in the thick silence. The storm pressed down like a weighted blanket, But beneath it, Marcus swore he could hear breathing. Slow, patient, not his own. When he reached the edge of the alley, he paused, scanning the square. The footprints he had followed were still there, glistening in the rain, ending in that impossible puddle. Nothing had changed. And yet, a faint detail pulled his gaze to the diner window. The glass, clouded and streaked, bore a streak of condensation, a smear that hadn't been there before. As if something had pressed against it from the inside, watching him from the shadows beyond. His stomach lurched. He hadn't seen anyone move, but the evidence was there, wet and undeniable. Marcus took a step back, instinct screaming that he was not welcome here. His hood slipped slightly, rain soaking his neck, but he hardly noticed. He forced himself to breathe evenly, eyes darting between the diner and the empty street. Then came the sound again, soft, deliberate, closer this time. Footsteps. He turned sharply toward the general store. For a fraction of a second, he thought he saw movement, a figure slipping out of sight behind the warped doorframe. He blinked, but the doorway was empty again, the rain disguising everything in shifting shadows. Adrenaline coursed through him. Marcus knew he couldn't stay in the open. Whoever, or whatever, was here wasn't just wandering. It was watching, waiting, and leading him on. He started back toward his car, forcing himself not to break into a sprint, each step heavy and deliberate. The headlights grew larger, a fragile beacon in the rain. But just as his hand touched the driver's side door handle, the radio inside crackled to life on its own. A voice whispered through the static, low and distorted, carrying a single word that made Marcus's blood run cold. Stay. Marcus yanked the car door open, sliding inside with wet clothes clinging to his skin. The whisper on the radio faded into static as he slammed it shut, but the unease lingered, burrowing under his ribs. He gripped the steering wheel, debating whether to drive, to flee into the black maze of roads. But before he could turn the key, a flicker of movement in his headlights caught his eye. A figure was standing in the square, just beyond the beams, their silhouette wavering in the downpour. For a long moment, Marcus didn't move. The figure stood still, neither approaching nor retreating. Their head was tilted slightly, as if studying him. The rain sheeted down between them, obscuring details, but Marcus thought he could make out a coat, long, heavy, dripping with water. Slowly, he lowered his window a crack. The cold rush of storm air hit him, carrying the faintest sound. A voice. At first, he thought it was the rain, but then he realized the figure was speaking. Whispering, "Turn back." The words were strained, warped by distance and storm. Marcus blinked, leaning forward, straining to hear. "Turn back," the voice repeated, clearer this time, but threaded with something that chilled him. It didn't sound like a warning so much as a plea. The figure shifted closer, and for an instant, Marcus's headlights caught their face. Pale skin, water streaming down sharp features, eyes hollow and sunken as though sleep, or life, had been absent for years. Marcus's instincts screamed to start the car, to leave without another thought. But his hands stayed frozen on the wheel. Against reason, he cracked the door open again, stepping halfway out into the rain. "What is this place?" he shouted over the storm. His voice echoed strangely, swallowed by the empty buildings. The figure took another step forward, shoes splashing in the shallow puddles. "Not yours," they whispered. "It was never yours." The words struck him as nonsensical, but the intensity in their eyes left no room for dismissal. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the figure recoiled. Their head jerked toward the church with its broken steeple, as though hearing something Marcus could not. A flicker of terror crossed their face, pure, raw, and unguarded. Without another word, they turned and vanished into the alleyways, swallowed by the shadows and rain. Marcus stood frozen by the car, the echo of their plea still hanging in the storm. For the first time, he realized he wasn't just lost in Duskfield. He had been brought here. Marcus stood drenched beside the car, staring at the alley where the stranger had disappeared. His every instinct told him to leave, to abandon Duskfield and never look back. Yet the figure's terrified glance toward the church lingered in his mind like a hook. The broken steeple jutted against the storm-dark sky, a jagged silhouette that seemed to beckon him. He climbed back into the car, hesitating only a moment before turning the ignition. The headlights swung across the square, catching on the warped doors of the church as if pointing him there. The drive was short, but each second stretched long. The tires hissed against the waterlogged pavement, the town slipping past in lifeless silence. As Marcus pulled closer, the church revealed its decay in full. Boards hung loose from the walls, stained glass windows were cracked or shattered, and the double doors sagged inward like tired lungs. Yet despite its ruin, faint light leaked from within, a flickering, inconsistent glow, as though from candles struggling against the dark. Marcus parked a few feet away, killing the engine, the silence hitting him like a weight that he approached cautiously, boots splashing in shallow puddles, each step echoing too loudly against the hushed storm. The air near the church felt different, still heavy, but charged, vibrating with something unseen. As he neared the doors, he heard it, a low murmur. Words spoken in unison, too faint to make out, but undeniably human. A gathering. Relief sparked through his nerves. Finally, people. He gripped the handle of the sagging door, its wood swollen with rain, and pushed. The interior smelled of mold and damp wood, mixed with the acrid tang of burnt wax. Rows of pews leaned unevenly, their wood cracked and splintering. At the far end, near the altar, a cluster of figures stood with their backs to him. They were cloaked in dark, tattered garments, hoods pulled low. Their voices blended into a drone, a language Marcus didn't recognize, syllables heavy and wet, like stones dropping into deep water. The candles before them guttered violently, though no draft touched them. Marcus froze in the doorway, unsure whether to announce himself or retreat. But then, without warning, the murmuring stopped. Every hooded head turned in unison, their faces still obscured by shadow. The silence pressed in, suffocating. One figure at the front raised a hand, slow and deliberate, pointing directly at him. Marcus's throat tightened as the words of the stranger echoed in his head. Turn back. But he had already stepped too far inside. Marcus stumbled backward, his shoulders slamming into the swollen wooden door. The hinges groaned as he shoved, desperate to get back into the rain, back to the safety of his car. But the door resisted, heavier than before, as though the church itself had decided to hold him in place. He shoved again, the wood rattling, his breath coming fast. Behind him, the silence of the hooded congregation deepened, thick enough to feel on his skin. He didn't dare look back. Finally, with a violent push, the door gave way, and Marcus spilled into the storm. The rain, cold and unrelenting, felt almost like relief against his face. He bolted toward his car, his boots splashing through puddles. But when he reached it, his chest tightening with hope, he froze. The car wasn't where he had left it. The headlights that had once glowed like a beacon were gone. The square stood empty, the pavement slick and black, as though the vehicle had never existed. Panic surged. He spun in circles, searching the darkness, but the church loomed behind him and the empty town pressed on all sides. The storm muted into a dull roar, the world collapsing into a tunnel of sound and shadow. Marcus's mind clawed for explanations. Had the storm disoriented him? Had he parked elsewhere? But the truth sank in heavy and undeniable. Something in Duskfield had taken it from him. Not stolen, not moved, erased. He staggered away from the church, deeper into the streets. The houses stared back with their dark windows, hollow and hungry. The stranger's warning returned to him. Turn back. But there was no road to turn onto now, no sign of escape. His only choice was forward. Every street seemed to lead him in circles, bringing him past the same broken lampposts, the same shuttered storefronts. His breaths came in ragged bursts, and the rain poured harder, almost drowning the sound of his own footsteps, until another pair joined them. Marcus froze mid-step, heart in his throat. Behind him, through the curtain of rain, he heard it clearly, wet, deliberate footsteps matching his own pace. Slowly he turned. The square was empty. The alleyways were empty. The street behind him stretched on, deserted. Yet the sound persisted, each step in sync with his, closing the distance one pace at a time. The storm howled, but beneath it, Marcus swore he could hear someone whispering his name. Marcus's breath came fast, each exhale visible in the storm's chill. He turned in circles, scanning the street, the alleys, the sagging porches of abandoned houses. The footsteps stopped when he stopped, started again when he moved. It was deliberate, intelligent. The rain blurred his vision, but he knew he wasn't imagining it. Something was out there, just beyond the reach of sight, waiting for him to make the wrong move. That a flicker of movement caught his eye near the diner. At first, he thought it was a trick of the headlights reflecting off the puddles, but then the shape shifted again, long, bent, unnaturally slow. A figure stepped into the street, its outline warped by the sheets of rain. It wasn't hooded like the congregation. Its body was gaunt, elongated, the proportions wrong, as though someone had stretched human bones too far. Water streamed down its pale skin, pooling at its feet. Marcus staggered back, his stomach lurching. The thing cocked its head at him, an uncanny imitation of curiosity. Its eyes were hollow sockets, yet they seemed to fix directly on him. The footsteps he had heard were not boots or shoes, but the wet slap of bare feet against stone. It opened its mouth, impossibly wide, and the sound that spilled out wasn't a voice but a low, distorted imitation of his own. "Marcus," it whispered, in his tone, broken and wrong. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but his legs felt rooted to the spot. The creature took another step forward, deliberate and slow, as if savoring the distance. The rain bent strangely around it, cascading down in sheets that seemed drawn toward its body rather than away. Marcus forced himself to move, stumbling backward toward the nearest alley. His boots splashed through the water, his heart hammering. He didn't dare look back until he reached the cover of shadow. When he finally risked a glance, the street was empty again. The creature had vanished as suddenly as it appeared, leaving only the echo of his name in the storm. But Marcus knew it hadn't left. Duskfield wasn't the kind of place where things left. It was waiting, watching, and now it knew who he was. Marcus pressed his back against the damp brick of the alley wall, rain dripping off his hood in steady rivulets. His chest heaved, each breath sharp and shallow. The street outside lay empty, but he could still feel it, the presence, the weight of unseen eyes. He tried to steady himself, tried to plan his next move, but the silence that followed only heightened the dread. Then, softly, from somewhere beyond the storm, came the distorted whisper again, "Marcus." The sound crawled over his skin, closer now, impossible to place. He bolted from the alley, sprinting blindly down the nearest street. His boots splashed through puddles, each footfall chased by another set, wet, heavy, slapping the ground just behind him. He didn't dare turn to look. He didn't need to. The creature was there, pacing him, driving him forward like prey funneled toward a trap. Street after street blurred past, the town folding in on itself, always leading him back to the same landmarks. The diner, the general store, the sagging houses with their empty windows. Duskfield was a maze, and he was caught in its design. And then, as if by intention, the road opened again into the square. The church loomed ahead, candlelight still flickering faintly through its cracked windows, a beacon of something. Whether salvation or damnation, Marcus couldn't tell. The footsteps behind him grew louder, splashing harder, closing the gap. He pushed himself toward the church doors, lungs burning, legs numb. The storm muffled into a dull roar, as though the entire town were holding its breath. Just as he reached the sagging entrance, he felt it, cold, clammy air brushing against his neck, too close to be anything but a hand reaching for him. He threw his weight into the doors and stumbled inside. The church swallowed him whole. The doors slammed shut behind with a thunderous crack, sealing out the rain. Marcus collapsed against the warped wood, drenched and gasping. When he lifted his head, the congregation was waiting. The hooded figures hadn't moved from their semicircle at the altar, their candles burning steady now, no longer guttering. In perfect unison, they lowered their hoods. Faces pale, eyes hollow, their voices rose together, addressing him with the same word the creature had used, "Marcus." Marcus stood frozen in the church's dim glow, the hooded figures encircling him with their hollow stares. Their voices merged into a low chant, his name repeated over and over, each syllable warped until it no longer sounded like language, but like the storm itself. The air thickened, pressing down on his chest. He staggered backward, searching for any escape, when the candles flared violently, casting shadows that seemed to twist and writhe on the walls. Then, as suddenly as they had spoken, the congregation fell silent. Every face turned toward the door. A wet, deliberate slap echoed from outside. The creature, The hooded figures did not move to stop it. Instead, one raised an arm and pointed at Marcus, as if offering him up. The doors creaked, strained, and began to buckle inward under an unseen force. Panic surged through him. He darted toward a side aisle, his boots pounding against warped boards, and spotted a narrow door half hidden by rotting curtains. He threw it open, the hinges screaming, and found himself in a stairwell descending into darkness. The air below was colder, carrying the scent of damp earth and mildew. He stumbled down the steps, the sound of the creature's approach growing louder above. The chanting resumed faintly, muffled now, as though the congregation were sealing him inside. At the bottom, he found another door, rusted metal, half buried in dirt. He shoved with every ounce of strength, the frame groaning, until it gave way and he spilled out into the storm again. Marcus found himself on a back road, overgrown but real. For the first time since entering Duskfield, he saw headlights in the distance. Moving headlights, a car approaching. Relief surged, hot and dizzying. He stumbled forward, waving his arms, shouting over the rain. The car slowed, its beams cutting through the downpour, and as it rolled to a stop, Marcus saw a woman behind the wheel. She lowered the window, her face concerned, her voice steady and human. "Are you all right? You're drenched." Marcus nearly collapsed with gratitude. He climbed into the passenger seat, dripping water onto the upholstery, stammering thanks. The car pulled away, its wipers slicing at the rain, headlights cutting a clear path ahead. He sank into the seat, exhaustion washing over him. But then he glanced into the side mirror. For a split second, through the blur of rain, he thought he saw it. His own hollow-eyed reflection staring back, mouth opening wider than it should. When he turned, the mirror showed only darkness and rain. Yet deep down, Marcus knew some part of Duskfield had followed him out.